Hello. All right. So thank you all so much for joining us here today. And so, as you can see from the lengthy title, we want to talk about the importance of D&I as we're developing new technologies. And I'm so excited to be here with three amazing women, all working on very different things at Google. And so I think a takeaway just off the bat is think about working with a lens of inclusion can come from any role, from any discipline. As the woman introduced, I'm Leah Garvin. I am a senior operations manager at Google, focusing on how to make the way we work more inclusive. So looking at systems and processes that are happening on teams and how we can ensure that those are really including everyone so they can do their best work. So I'd love to turn it over to the three here to introduce themselves and talk about what they do at Google.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharifa Vincent. I actually work with Leah. I am the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager for Daydream, which, if you don't know, is Google's AR, VR product area. And so my role is really about making Daydream itself, but also Google, sort of the most inclusive place that it can be. And we do that through a variety of ways, through hiring, representation, culture, and product inclusion. So we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jameelah Smith Loud. I sit on the trust and safety team in Google as a researcher, and I lead the track around AI ethics and social equity related research. And so the work I do feeds a lot into our newly developed ethics process, as well as our ongoing work on ML fairness. And so it's a lot of foundational research as well as impact assessments to kind of aid our product teams as they're thinking about how to make their products better.
Hello. Hi, my name is Marissa, and I'm a software engineer on Geo for Everyone, which is pretty much a team that uses geo tools like Street View or Google Earth to, as I like to say, make the world a better place. Myself, I work on measuring solar energy potential and measuring or modeling carbon emissions for cities so they can come up with climate action plans and reduce their footprint.
Awesome. So I'd love to go round robin again and just ask each of you, why is diversity and inclusion important to you and how you really fold that into your work?
I guess I can start. As a woman of color in tech, this matters a lot to me. So what I try to do is I'm a mentor, and I try to speak. I do sit at the front of the meeting rooms and at the table, and I go to conferences, and I try to speak out loud about my experiences so I can inspire and promote more women of color to join our teams.
I think so. So I've only been at Google for 2 years, and prior to coming to Google, I was at a civil rights nonprofit, working on kind of racial equity work and thinking about how to provide research to on-the-ground organizers that is related to racial equity-based initiatives. And so I think on one side, so that kind of grounds my own approach in my work, and so it kind of influences the way I think about it, the way I frame problems, and even the way that I frame solutions. I think on a personal level, as a Black woman, as a mother of teenage boys, when I'm thinking about these technologies and their deployment in real life, I think that's what grounds kind of me in a very different way. So there's, kind of practical when I'm thinking about research methods and what can I learn from the approaches from groups who've been working on kind of civil rights and human rights based strategies that influences my work, and then my own personal experience in my day-to-day going through the world probably influences me even more.
So I hope mine is obvious. I get to do this as my day job and get paid for it, which was not always the case. I think my passion sort of comes from, we hear about Google being sort of the best place to work in this amazing company that's sort of like Disneyland for adults. And when I started at Google, it was absolutely all of those things. Great benefits, food every 150 feet that you could pick up, right? It actually is a problem. But also, there was something missing for me. And as a Black woman at Google, I wanted my experience to be the same as everyone else's. I wanted to be able to say, yes, it is the best place to work. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we don't always get it right. Google does not always get it right. And that's one of the reasons that I do the work that I do now. Even before I was in this role, I made sure to sort of fold everything into my brand. So at Google, you can do something called 20% projects. And when I first started at Google, that's how I first got involved with D&I. I dedicated 20% of my work time, which, let's be honest, it's more like 120% if we're being real. But I dedicated that part of my time to building out a project that was important to me around diversity and inclusion. And so ever since then, I've started working on initiatives and programs and things like that that are really focused in this area. So it's a passion for me just personally. I'm always interested in different people and cultures. And for work, I want Google to be the place, the best place to work for me and for everyone else.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you all. Marissa, I'd love to run back to you to answer this next one. So as an engineer, how do you leverage some of these new technologies to make products more inclusive?
This is very exciting. So on the data side, there's a lot of, so in Jia, we provide a lot of services such as directions or stories about indigenous cultures or anything like Earth related. But it's very hard to do that if we have fuzzy data quality. So what machine learning can actually do, what we can do with it, is actually make blurry data much more clear. For example, we use a lot of satellite imagery. And some places we have like centimeter resolution, and that's great. But some places we have way less good resolution. So we can train models to actually identify roads or buildings. Recently, we actually were able to generate a lot of building outlines, which is the things you see when you scroll into Google Maps. You can see little buildings. And we were able to do that, and now we have probably almost 1 billion building footprints all around the world. So we're able to extend our services to all these other countries as well.
Awesome. For maybe Jameelah and Sharifa, who work a little bit closer to the D&I space, I'm curious, a lot of this work is volunteer, community organization, or ERGs. A lot of it's bottoms up. But I think we've learned that to really have accountability in organizations, you have to have some tops-down leverage as well. I'd love for each of you to answer, how do you influence leaders? How do you help leaders hold people accountable to being more inclusive?
I can go first. I think there's not one good answer for that. I think, like I said, I work on a team that works a lot on kind of the operations of our ethics process. And so that experience is a little bit different, where we're trying to make sure that we still include the bottoms-up conversation, so all of the wealth and insight of Googlers who represent diverse backgrounds into our ethics process. And so I think doing that has, it's not always easy, and there's always this kind of challenge of how do we translate people's everyday concerns to then making product changes and making business decisions. And it really, I think, requires kind of using a mix of strategies. And I think so, sometimes I think, I have to have the best data. I gotta have this great report that says, don't do this. Or, it's not always easy. And then sometimes it comes from being able to tell a story and being able to connect it with someone's real life experience. And so I think it is really trying to think about, one, your audience. Our team is comprised a lot of social scientists and people who don't come from a necessarily technical background. So it really is trying to think, how do we merge kind of qualitative understandings of equity and of fairness to decision makers who are often thinking primarily in business terms or primarily in technical terms. And so I think we're in constant conversation of how to make that translation more clear, but I think it's part of the process. And I think with the ethics process, in which we now have a governance structure that demands that we're listening to multiple voices, it makes it a little bit easier than it was even when I started 2 years ago.
I guess I'll start by saying that I want to make sure that we recognize first those people from the bottom up, right? Because they are the ones who have been since the beginning, since before D&I was like a buzz term, have been doing the work and moving the needle to where we are now. But similar to a question that was asked in the previous panel about how do you not get those people burned out, it is absolutely a real thing, burnout for working on D&I work. And I think that's where our leaders have to come in and have to sort of risk their privilege, right? We hear about this a lot, but it's no secret that the makeup of our leaders in Google tends to be a little bit more homogenous, right? And so those folks who are already in power, they have to be willing to risk a little bit of their power to make sure that they're pushing these initiatives forward. I will also say that I think sometimes we want to jump to, well, just make it mandatory, like tie it to their compensation. You know, if they don't do this, if they don't do that, then they get dinged. And my gut feeling, in some instances, I think that can be a realistic example, but in my gut feeling, we don't want to turn people off from this. This is not a tech problem. This is not a Google problem. This is a society problem. And it's really important that we remember that this is hard. This is a hard problem to solve. And so rather than turning people off and pushing them away by making it something that becomes all of a sudden a negative experience, let's figure out how we can lead people to that, right? And so I think there's a couple of ways. I think to Jameelah's point, there's empathy, right? We do some things that Google called listen-ins, leadership listen-ins. And this is where our leaders are really able to hear from the Googlers who are experiencing these things in the company exactly what is going on. So it's more than just numbers on a page. It's hearing people's lived experience, how I walk through this organization and how that may be different from yours. Because I think that we can't assume that they just know that already. So it's building that empathy, but it's also meeting people sort of where they are in their journey. This is a journey for sure, and a lot of people are at day zero of this journey where they don't even understand why this is important. And I think that sometimes we think that it has to be a versus of moral obligation, this is the right thing to do, versus business imperative, right? And I don't think that it's a versus, but an and in this situation that I heard someone say previously. And some people will do it because it's the right thing. Some people will do it, though, because it is a business imperative. And it's okay for those people to start their journey from that perspective. And so part of what we also try to do is to provide leaders with the data of their organizations. Here's what your organization looks like in terms of culture, inclusion, right, the happiness of your Googlers, but also from your hiring numbers. Here's what your org looks like, right? Here are the attrition numbers. Here are the hiring numbers that you're actually bringing in. And when people can see that on paper, no one is going to sit and say, oh, I don't care. If you come back to them the next day and say, are you okay with your organization being like this? Whether they believe it or not, no one is going to say to you, no, they aren't. And so I think it's really important that we do both. We bring them together from empathy and getting them proximate to the communities, right, that are experiencing any of our challenges, but also using the data to back that up.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add something that Sharif and I were just talking about yesterday, which is as you're bringing leaders in and giving them the information, giving them permission to ask questions and to be learning. Like, I think one of the reasons that leaders maybe hold back is because the spotlight's on them and they don't want to get it wrong. And the stakes are very, very high. And so, you know, letting them ask questions or saying, is this okay if I say this? Or leaning on them as, like, in a safer space, like, let's bounce off ideas about how you can talk about this, gives them permission to be learning, because everybody's learning. We all don't know about every single nuance of every single culture, and so not like lowering the stakes in a sense of that learning curve. Sharifa, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, I think it's it's important to remember that, like, we're all going to mess this up. Like, every time, right? I mess up on a daily basis. I still say things that I've been conditioned to say, and so it's important to remember that and to make sure that we're not just like demonizing people for making the mistake. Acting is the biggest piece that you can do, even though you know you're going to make a mistake.
Awesome. So, as many of us know, Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. But we also know that not everyone has the same access to information. So, I'd love to hear, Marissa, maybe from you, some examples from Geo of how you've made information more accessible.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of piggybacks on the building footprints I was talking about before. So there are a lot of tools that actually use those footprints. We have a gender equity team that's focusing on women's safety in India when they're traveling to places, and that uses those maps. We have an accessibility team that works on wheelchair accessible routes that you can use with Google Maps as well. Even with the solar energy stuff that I work on, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, we were able to actually use those new building footprints to measure solar energy to tell the cities where it's best to put solar panels so they could provide their citizens energy while they were off the grid. So there are a bunch of tools like this. Another way we bring more information is through Street View, where we're able to identify local businesses that maybe don't have a website, and we can get their name and their hours and put it online for the rest of the citizens to see.
Awesome. Jameelah or Sharifa, do you have any other examples you want to add?
Sure. I mean, I think my examples are a little bit different, but just in thinking about the strategies that we employ on the day-to-day, where the goal is really to kind of bake in a conversation about equity within the product process. Sometimes it is like purely from research. And so sometimes in terms of doing user studies, in terms of doing impact assessments, whether those are human rights impact assessments or social impact assessments, that's a one set of strategies that we employ to get our product teams to understand not just the direct user experience, but also kind of what are greater impacts of our products. And then, I also, are part of our team does product testing for inclusion and for fairness related issues. And it really is a process where, sometimes we all get in a room for a day with a product and think, on the basis of kind of fairness and equity indicators, how can we break this product so that the team knows where the gaps are, where the problems are? And so, for example, for a product like Google Translate, we spend a lot of time trying to break it so that we understood how it handled gendered pronouns. And so those are examples of where we're using adversarial testing in really kind of different ways to really get some results and be able to tell the product teams, not at an abstract level, but this is what happened when I put this in. This is what happened when I put this term in over and over, for example, on Translate, and these are the results we got. And so it's a way in which we collect data that is kind of in the reverse, so it's not their output data, but it's a way in which our teams say, we're going to go in, we're going to, create a different data set for the product team then to respond to.
Yeah. I think piggybacking off that, I think bias is a question that comes up in a lot of these new technologies. And Jameelah, I think you gave a great example there of how we're combating that. Sharifa or Marissa, do you have any other examples of really how we recognize where there might be bias in some of these systems and are really proactively trying to fight against that?
Yeah, so I'll speak from the perspective of people, right? I'm not an engineer, so I don't know all of the technical side of everything, but people are making these machines, right? People are making these algorithms. And so it's important to make sure that you have the right people around the table. And if you are on a team where certain voices are excluded, then yes, you're going to miss the mark. And so when I think back to times when Google has missed the mark, right, and you can Google it, right, what I'm talking about, there are many, but when there are times that we've missed the mark, I think about, and other companies that I've seen that have missed the mark in campaigns or advertising or things like that, I think to myself, if only this person had been at that table, this would have never gotten through, right? And it, for me, comes back to hiring and representation in your organizations. If you have a diverse set of voices around the table, it's much more likely that people are going to catch the issue or catch the problem, right? That they to Jameelah's point, when we're talking about inclusive products and testing, you have to get tested by the right users. It can't just be the people who are building the software that are doing the testing and then sending it out to the market, because they're building for themselves, right? They're only have their limited purview. And so we have to make sure that the team itself is diverse first, all the way from inception of the idea all the way through product testing. And so for me, it always comes back to hiring. Hiring. Get more diverse people in your organization and working on these products so that the team that's building it reflects the people and the users in the world that are going to be using your product.
+1 on that. I couldn't agree more. And I think when we talk about product inclusion, so much is focused on that like end result, like getting the product out the door, but we can have solved so many of the issues like way up front if we have the people in place as contributors, as decision makers, not only as testers. So totally agree. I think our last question would be, any calls to action? You know, we have this group of people all passionate about this space. Is there any other thing we would love to ask of this group here while we have them? Marissa?
Yeah, mine's pretty short and sweet. I would say speak up, be proud, and definitely apply. We want more diversity in our engineers too.
Yes.
I think I would say that I feel like, at least for my teams and from my experience, we're at an interesting moment, particularly as we're thinking about how do we deploy AI in an ethical way, and that conversation is kind of dominating, for many, dominating the field. And so I think it's a huge growth opportunity for people outside of tech to define what those impacts are, to define what's okay and what's not okay, and then to be in conversation with the technology companies. I think that for us and for many companies, that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're open to, is to be having those conversations in an ongoing way. Because, me as a researcher, sometimes I'm like, that's not okay, but it's not because Jameelah said it's not okay. It's because there's this whole body, there's this whole movement, there's a whole set of researchers and teams and policymakers and advocates who are saying it as well. And so I think it just really is an opportunity moment for us to be in conversation.
Yeah.
And I would just say, keep fighting the good fight, right? Like, this is hard work. All of us are here because we're passionate about it. We really care about it. And we also know that it is extremely exhausting, right? Mentally, emotionally, this is very difficult work. And so don't, try not to grow weary, but remember about self-care and being able to take a step back when you need to. That is absolutely okay. And I would also say, for your organizations, if you can take back the idea of allyship training, right? This is a really great way of just getting other people involved, getting those people who have power or who are in the dominant or majority, I won't say dominant, I will say the majority group in our organizations, having them be able to step up as allies so that the entire burden is not on us to fix this problem, because we didn't create it, and so we're not going to be the only ones that can fix it.
I also wanted to give a quick plug that one of the teams that I'm working on, the Responsible Innovation team, is in the current search for a technical writer. So someone who has a background potentially in ethics or social science background, who's interested in working in that role, please reach out to me. Maybe on LinkedIn might be the best way if you're interested in knowing more about that role. So that's cool.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, everyone, so much.
All right.